Welcome to tonight's episode. This evening we'll be taking a gentle journey back in time to Victorian England, a world of candlelight, quiet carriages rolling through misty streets, and doctors with remedies that might seem rather strange to us today. Some of these cures were curious, some were unpleasant, and some were surprisingly inventive. But tonight, you don't need to try them. All you need to do is lie back, get comfortable, and let me tell you about them. Slowly, softly, one by one. So take a deep breath. Let it out. And picture yourself walking down a cobblestone street, the lamps glowing faintly in the fog, and the doors of an apothecary creaking open, inviting you inside. Before we step into the world of Victorian medicine, let's pause for a moment and imagine the setting. It is the mid-19th century. The streets are quiet, cobblestones glistening with evening rain. Gas lamps flicker with a warm golden light, their glow stretching softly into the fog. The air carries the faint sound of carriage wheels in the distance, and the gentle rhythm of horses' hooves. In homes, curtains are drawn, fires are lit, and the shadows of families move slowly against the window panes. Inside, people read by candlelight, sip tea from porcelain cups, and listen to the steady ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. But just around the corner, tucked between narrow shop fronts, there is an apothecary. Its shelves are lined with jars, bottles, and bundles of herbs. Strange powders sealed in little paper packets, and handwritten labels tied with string. The air smells faintly of lavender, camphor, and chalk dust. This is where Victorian cures are found. Medicine in this age was a curious mixture. Part science, part superstition. Doctors carried stethoscopes, but also leeches. Families might trust a new tonic with a shiny label promising relief, or cling to old remedies whispered from one generation to the next. It was a time of progress, but also of peculiar beliefs. And as we step quietly inside this apothecary, we find ourselves surrounded by rows of remedies, some familiar, some unusual, all waiting to be discovered, one by one. Our first stop is at a small wooden shelf, where glass jars stand in neat rows. Inside, something wriggles gently against the glass. These are leeches, small, dark, and, in the Victorian mind, very useful. For centuries, doctors believed that the body's health depended on balance. Too much of one fluid, or humor as they called it, could make you sick, and so bloodletting was considered a cure. By removing a little blood, they believed the balance could be restored. Sometimes this was done with sharp instruments, but more often, in the Victorian home, it was done with leeches. A leech would be placed carefully on the skin, where it would attach itself and begin to draw out blood. The sensation was said to be almost painless. The creature would slowly feed, then drop away, leaving a small mark behind. Doctors prescribed leeches for fevers, for headaches, even for sore throats. There was almost no illness in that age that someone didn't think could be cured with a leech. Apothecaries kept them in jars of clean water, ready for use. Housewives might even keep a few in the pantry to use when needed. It may sound unsettling to us now, but in the quiet Victorian parlor, this was considered perfectly ordinary. A visitor might arrive with a headache and be treated with tea, a little rest, and perhaps a leech or two. So as we leave behind the shelves of wriggling glass jars, we wander a little further into the apothecary, past the leeches, toward another remedy. This one, not for fevers, but for beauty. Now we pause by a small glass counter. Inside, laid neatly in little tins, are something called complexion wafers. They look innocent enough. Thin, pale discs, much like a piece of candy. But in Victorian England, these wafers contained something quite dangerous. They were made with arsenic. At the time, pale skin was considered the height of beauty. It suggested refinement, that one lived a gentle life, far away from sun and soil. And so, many women turned to these wafers, believing that a small dose would clear the skin, brighten the face, and give it that fashionable porcelain glow. Each wafer would be placed carefully on the tongue and allowed to dissolve. The practice was secretive, almost whispered about, but advertisements promised miracles, a flawless complexion, a healthy glow. Today, of course, we know arsenic as a poison, but in the quiet drawing rooms of Victorian England, these little wafers were sold with elegance and charm. The tins bore delicate lettering, and sometimes even floral patterns, as if what lay inside were as harmless as a sweet. It is strange to imagine someone closing their eyes, placing an arsenic wafer on their tongue, and thinking of it as medicine. But in those days, the line between cure and harm was not always so clear. And so we leave the glass counter behind. The wafers remain in their tins, unopened, waiting for another curious customer. Our steps carry us further, to a darker shelf. Bottles of thick liquid rest here, their labels written in careful, flowing script. These are cough syrups, and they hold their own secret. On a high wooden shelf behind the counter sit rows of small glass bottles. Their stoppers are sealed with wax, and faded labels cling to the glass. If we look closely, the words are written in careful script. Soothing syrup, cough remedy, children's cordial. Inside, the liquid is dark and thick, with a faint sweetness. These were the cough syrups of Victorian England, and almost all of them contained opium. Opium was thought of as a gentle cure-all. A drop or two could calm a cough, settle a restless child, soothe an aching body. Mothers often gave it to infants when teething pains kept them crying through the night. A teaspoon, stirred into warm milk, promised relief and rest. The bottles themselves were works of art. Some were cobalt blue, others amber brown, to protect the medicine from the light. Embossed glass letters proudly declared the maker's name, while handwritten notes described the dose. But though it was meant to heal, these syrups could be dangerous. Many who took them found themselves dependent, unable to stop. And yet, in the dim lamplight of a Victorian sick room, they must have felt like a blessing, a way to bring calm to a restless night. Imagine the quiet scene. A child tucked into bed, feverish and coughing. A spoonful of syrup given by candlelight. The room grows still. The cough fades, and sleep returns. These bottles remain on the shelf, their contents untouched. And so, we move on, past the glinting glass, past the soft dust that gathers on their corks, toward something stranger still. On a small wooden table, in a shallow dish, sits an object you might not expect to find in a doctor's shop. A small, green frog. On a low table, in a shallow porcelain dish, rests a small green frog. Its skin glistens faintly, as though it has just been lifted from a garden pond. It blinks slowly, quietly, unaware of the purpose it once served in Victorian medicine. For in those days, it was believed that a frog could cure a sore throat. The method was curious, even a little absurd. A live frog was placed carefully against the patient's neck, sometimes held there by a cloth, sometimes allowed to sit on its own. The belief was that the frog would draw out the illness, absorbing the swelling and fever until the throat was healed. Some accounts tell us that patients were instructed simply to let the frog sit quietly for as long as it wished. And when it hopped away, the cure was said to be complete. It is a strange image. A quiet Victorian bedroom. A child resting under heavy quilts. A candle flickering on the bedside table. And there, on the pillow, or gently tied at the throat, a frog, sitting patiently. To us now, it sounds like something from a storybook. But for many in the 19th century, it was just another remedy. A little odd, perhaps, but worth a try. The frog blinks once more, and in our imagination, it hops softly back into the dish. Its work done. We move on, leaving behind the croak of this peculiar cure. Ahead of us, on another shelf, is something even stranger. A small bowl, filled with powder, made from ground, dried mice. On a worn wooden counter, we notice a small earthenware bowl. At first, it looks like it might hold a simple herbal powder, but on closer look, the label reveals something stranger. Pulverized mouse. Yes. In Victorian England, a common cure for toothache was the humble house mouse. The method was simple, though not pleasant. A dead mouse would be dried, ground, and sometimes mixed with other ingredients until it formed a paste. This paste was then applied directly to the aching tooth, or rubbed along the gums, with the belief that it would draw out the pain. It wasn't only toothaches, either. Earlier traditions suggested that mouse paste could be used for warts, or even small wounds. The logic was less about science, and more about long tradition, passed down through generations of folk practice. By the time of the Victorians, these cures still lingered, especially in rural areas, where professional doctors were scarce, and people relied on what they had at hand. Imagine, if you will, a quiet kitchen in the English countryside, a family gathered by the hearth, a child complaining of tooth pain. With no access to a dentist and few other remedies to hand, the mother turns to this ancient practice. A pinch of ground mouse, pressed gently to the sore tooth, offered in hope of relief. It may sound unsettling to us now, but to them, it was a small comfort. One more way of keeping pain at bay when options were limited. The bowl of powder sits quietly on the counter, its use fading into history. And we too move on, stepping toward another shelf, where bottles of strong-smelling liquids wait. Turpentine and castor oil. On a high shelf, among dusty jars, stand two bottles side by side. One is filled with a pale, oily liquid, the other with a sharp, clear fluid that gives off a strong, almost biting smell. These are castor oil and turpentine. Both were widely used in Victorian medicine. Castor oil, pressed from the seeds of the castor plant, was one of the most common household remedies. It was given as a laxative, a way to cleanse the body, to purge illness from within. Parents would keep it ready in the pantry, and a spoonful was often prescribed for children who were unwell. The taste was bitter, unpleasant, but it was thought to keep the body pure and healthy. Turpentine, on the other hand, was far harsher. Derived from pine resin, it was used both inside and out. A few drops, mixed with sugar or honey, might be taken to ease coughs or chest problems. And rubbed onto the skin, turpentine was believed to draw out pain, especially in aching joints or sore muscles. The sharp scent filled the room wherever it was used. Imagine a Victorian sick room, heavy with the smell of oil lamps and damp linens. And now, the pungent sting of turpentine in the air. To us it seems harsh, dangerous even. But in the 19th century, these were staples of the medicine cabinet. Remedies believed to cleanse, to soothe, to heal, even if they often did more harm than good. The bottles rest quietly on their shelf, their labels faded, their corks sealed tight. And as we leave them behind, we notice something glimmering further along the wall. Strange contraptions of leather and wire, studded with little metal discs. These are the electric belts and devices. Another curiosity of Victorian medicine. Electricity was still new, mysterious, and full of promise. Many believed it could heal almost anything. And so, these devices, known as electric belts or galvanic bands, were advertised as cures for weakness, pain, or fatigue. The belts were worn around the waist, or sometimes across the shoulders. Some were connected to small batteries, delivering a faint tingling current. Others contained no electricity at all. Yet they were still sold with the promise of renewed health and vigor. Imagine the scene. A man in his study, adjusting the straps of his electric belt, waiting for the gentle pulse of energy to restore his strength. Or a woman fastening one around her waist, believing it might soothe her nerves. The idea of electricity running through the body was both strange and hopeful. Today we know these devices as curiosities, more novelty than cure. But in the 19th century, they represented progress, a glimpse of a future where science might banish illness altogether. We leave the belts where they are, silent and still, their promises tucked away in faded advertisements. And as we move on, deeper into the apothecary, we notice yet another shelf of peculiar remedies, waiting quietly to be discovered. On a polished shelf, among the finer bottles, stands a row of small glass vials Each one is dark brown, sealed with a cork, and labeled in delicate script. The word reads, laudanum. Laudanum was a tincture of opium, dissolved in strong alcohol. In Victorian England, it was everywhere. It was sold as a cure for sleeplessness, for pain, for coughs, for stomach aches. It was taken by mothers, by workers, even by children. A few drops in water or milk, and the troubles of the body seemed to melt away. For many, it was a comfort in times of hardship. Imagine a laborer, weary after a long day, reaching for a vial of laudanum to soothe his aches, or a mother rocking a restless child, offering just a spoonful to bring quiet sleep. Writers and poets of the age spoke of it too. Thomas de Quincey famously wrote of his experiences in Confessions of an English Opium Eater, describing both the relief and the dreams it brought. For some, it was medicine. For others, escape. The bottles gleam softly under the lamplight, their contents dark and heavy. What was once seen as healing, we now know to be dangerously addictive. But in Victorian England, laudanum was a trusted companion. We leave the vials untouched on their shelf, resting in silence. And as we move further into the apothecary, we notice another remedy, sharp and metallic, with a dangerous glimmer. A jar marked simply, mercury. Mercury had been used for centuries, but in the 19th century, it became a staple of medicine. Doctors prescribed mercury ointments, mercury pills, and even mercury vapor baths. It was most famously used to treat syphilis, a disease that carried great fear and stigma. Patients would rub mercury on their skin, swallow it in small doses, or sit in special boxes while mercury fumes surrounded their bodies. The theory was simple. Mercury would purge the illness. But in truth, it often caused terrible harm. Teeth fell out, gums became sore, and the body weakened under the weight of poison. Still, for many, it was seen as the only hope. Imagine a Victorian doctor's office, a small room lined with bottles and medical texts. A patient sits quietly, pale and unwell, while the doctor carefully mixes a mercury ointment, promising it will draw out the sickness. The air is heavy with the metallic scent, sharp and strange. Today, we know mercury is dangerous, something to be handled with extreme care. But in that age, it was medicine, trusted, prescribed, and used across the land. The jar remains sealed now, its surface glimmering faintly in the lamplight. And as we leave it behind, we step softly toward another remedy, one far more ordinary in appearance, yet equally peculiar. A simple jar of black powder, taken straight from the soot of a chimney. To us it seems like nothing more than the dust of a chimney. But in Victorian England, soot was thought to have healing powers. Mixed with butter, it was spread over cuts and scrapes, in the belief that it would seal the wound and prevent infection. Stirred into honey, it was swallowed to ease a sore throat. The rough, black powder thought to coat the pain. In some homes, soot was even applied to ulcers or inflamed skin, as a cheap and ready-made remedy taken straight from the fireplace. It was medicine born not of science, but of necessity. For the poor, there was no expensive apothecary bottle, no delicate vial of laudanum. There was only what the home could provide, and soot was always near at hand. Picture the scene. A cottage on the edge of town. A child scrapes a knee while playing outside. The mother takes a pinch of soot from the hearth, mixes it gently with butter, and spreads it carefully across the wound. A simple act, guided by old belief, passed down from one generation to the next. The jar of soot rests quietly now, its black dust settled at the bottom. And as we leave it behind, we notice another bottle nearby. The liquid inside is sharp, pungent, and clear. Its label reads, carbolic acid. In the middle of the 19th century, surgery was dangerous. Wounds often became infected, and patients died not from the operation itself, but from the fever that followed. Then came Joseph Lister, a surgeon who believed that invisible germs were the cause. His solution was this very liquid, carbolic acid. Lister used it to clean wounds, to wash instruments, even to spray the air during operations. And slowly, the death rate from infection began to fall. Carbolic acid was hailed as a miracle, the dawn of modern antiseptic medicine. But in the household, it was sometimes misused. Bottles of carbolic acid were sold to the public, and people dabbed it directly on cuts and sores. Some even gargled with it for sore throats, a practice that was as painful as it was dangerous. The burning sensation was said to mean it was working. Imagine the scene. A quiet Victorian kitchen. A child with a scraped arm. A parent opens a bottle of carbolic acid, dips a cloth inside, and presses it firmly against the wound. The child winces, the sharp sting filling the air. And yet, in that moment, it was considered healing. The bottle sits now in silence, its contents still and clear. What was once a great hope of medicine is today handled with extreme care. As we step past it, the shelves begin to thin. But here and there, we notice remedies of a simpler sort. Not bottles or powders, but spirits. A small cluster of bottles glimmers in the lamplight. Whiskey, gin, and port wine, each prescribed as medicine. In Victorian England, alcohol was more than a drink. It was a cure. Doctors prescribed whiskey for colds, port wine for weakness, and gin for digestion. A splash of brandy was thought to steady the nerves. A glass of stout was recommended for nursing mothers, believed to strengthen both mother and child. It was given for sleep, for fever, for pain. Hospitals even kept stocks of alcohol in the dispensary, ready to be poured into glasses as medicine. The line between treatment and comfort was faint, but in those times it hardly mattered. Picture the quiet of a Victorian sick room. The patient lies in bed, pale and tired. A glass of port is placed gently at their side. They sip slowly, the warmth spreading through their chest, easing pain, calming the mind. For a moment at least, the cure feels real. Of course, we know now that alcohol was not a medicine at all. But in a world without antibiotics or modern pain relief, it was one of the few comforts people had. The bottles rest quietly now, their once precious contents long gone. And as we leave them behind, another jar catches the eye. It is filled with a pale green liquid, faintly glowing in the lamplight. Its label reads simply, chlorodyne. It was perhaps the most famous Victorian cure-all, invented in the 1840s by a man named Dr. J. Collis Brown. Chlorodyne was sold in bottles across Britain and beyond. It was advertised for almost every ailment: cholera, coughs, insomnia, stomach cramps, even the pains of nervousness. The reason it worked was also the reason it was so dangerous. Chlorodyne was a mixture of chloroform, cannabis, and morphine. A single spoonful could calm pain, silence a cough, or ease the restless mind. It could also bring a deep, heavy sleep, one that sometimes lasted far too long. Imagine the Victorian household at night. A mother gives her crying child a drop of chlorodyne to help them rest. The room grows quiet. The candle burns low. Outside, the streets are still. To the family, the cure is worked, but silently, it has also left its mark. For many, dependence on chlorodyne became a hidden part of daily life. In its time, it was called a blessing, even a miracle. Today, we would call it something else entirely: a dangerous addiction in a bottle. The green glass rests quietly now, a ghost of its history. And just beside it, another remedy waits, humbler, but no less strange. A jar filled with vinegar and brown paper. Together, they made one of the most familiar household remedies of the Victorian age. Vinegar and brown paper was used as a cooling compress. The paper was soaked in vinegar, wrung out gently, and then laid across the forehead or a swollen bruise. It was meant to draw out heat, to soothe fever, or to ease pain. It was cheap, it was simple, and almost every home could make it. The cure was so well known that it even found its way into nursery rhymes. Jack and Jill went up the hill. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. Up Jack got, and home did trot, as fast as he could caper, and went to bed to mend his head with vinegar and brown paper. Picture the scene. A Victorian child resting in bed, their forehead wrapped in damp paper, the faint scent of vinegar filling the room. For a family with little money, this was comfort enough. The folded paper rests quietly now, dry and brittle with age. A relic of everyday medicine, carried not in apothecary bottles, but in rhyme and memory. And as we move further down the shelf, the remedies begin to change. For with cures such as chlorodyne, carbolic acid, and opium came consequences. Addiction, poisoning, and pain hidden behind the promise of relief. The Victorian medicine cabinet gave comfort, yes, but also carried shadows. The shelves stand quiet now. The bottles do not speak, but in their silence, we begin to hear something else. The consequences of these cures. For while Victorian medicine often promised hope, it carried hidden costs. Costs that weighed quietly, and sometimes tragically, on those who reached for them. Let us begin with opium. To the weary mother, it was a blessing. A spoonful of laudanum brought sleep to a restless child. It calmed fevers, hushed coughs, and softened cries. But night after night, dose after dose, dependence crept silently in. Infants lulled to sleep too often with laudanum, sometimes never stirred again, and adults who turned to it for their own aches and sorrows found themselves caught in a cycle of need, the bottle becoming less a remedy and more a chain. Carbolic acid brought new hope in the hands of Joseph Lister, the great surgeon who introduced antiseptic technique. For the first time, wounds could be cleaned, instruments sterilized, infection held at bay. It was a revolution in medicine. And yet, when bottles of carbolic acid were sold to households, accidents followed. On bare skin, it burned fiercely, leaving red, raw wounds where it was meant to heal. Some gargled it for sore throats. The sharp sting thought to mean it was working, while in truth it damaged delicate tissue. A miracle, yes, but one that demanded precision the average home did not have. Even the humble cures carried shadows. Alcohol, given as medicine, comforted the sick, calmed the feverish, and gave strength to the weak. But it also created dependence, and in some cases, worsened illness. The boundary between remedy and indulgence was fragile. The shelves stand quiet now. The bottles do not speak, but in their silence we begin to hear something else. The consequences of these cures. For while Victorian medicine often promised hope, it carried hidden costs. The simpler home cures, like soot mixed with butter, vinegar pressed in brown paper, mustard plasters burning against the skin, did no real harm on their own. But they often disguised the seriousness of illness. A fever wrapped in paper, a wound blackened with chimney dust, while infection and disease crept on unnoticed beneath. And there were greater tragedies too. Patent medicines, sold in bright bottles with bold promises, often contained poisons, hidden behind names like tonic or elixir. Arsenic was slipped into beauty treatments to pale the skin. Mercury appeared in ointments and pills. Children swallowed soothing syrups laced with narcotics. None knew, at first, the damage being done. Picture a Victorian home. A child lies restless with a cough. The mother reaches for a bottle, perhaps laudanum, perhaps a syrup laced with morphine, and measures out a careful spoonful. The child drifts to sleep. The candle burns low. Outside, the gas lamps flicker along the cobbled street. For the family, this is medicine. This is care. And in that moment, it brings relief. And so, the cabinet of Victorian medicine closes for now. Its jars and bottles still stand, quiet with history, remedies of soot and vinegar, of laudanum and chlorodyne, each carrying their own stories of comfort and consequence. Some soothed, some harmed. Some lingered in memory through rhyme and song. All of them remind us of a time when medicine was as much hope as it was science. The candle fades. The streets outside grow still, and the shelves rest once again in silence. And with them, we too can rest. Good night.